Welcome to Wiser Dialogue, conversations with women of color about issues, policies, and research that impact our lives. Today, my guest is Nicole MartinRogers. She is the Senior Research Manager at Wilder Research. Welcome, Nicole.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So I'm super excited to have Nicole with us today. This is the month that the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race will celebrate our 5th anniversary. And so I'm really excited to have a conversation with someone else who is pushing the disaggregation of data. So Nicole, I'd like to start with, I'll tell you a little bit about why I push for the disaggregation of data, and like to then hear why you push for the disaggregation of data. For me, there was just this anger about the erasure of our lived experiences and not paying attention to what happens when you disaggregate data, like the nuances that you see that I think really are important for crafting effective policy. So tell us a little bit about how you got into having this push for disaggregation of data.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's something I definitely have thought a lot about in my career. So I'm a sociologist, and I work at a nonprofit organization, and we're mission driven, attempting to address social issues, right? And so for me, I really care about variables that make a difference in explaining or understanding or helping to solve social problems or issues. And so I really care about disaggregating data in a way that helps us to understand these things. And in some cases, it can be broader racial categories that it can help us understand differences in experience or differences in outcomes. Other times it might be a more intersectional approach. So for example, I have an American Indian background, and I'm a descendant of White Earth Nation, which is a tribe located in northern Minnesota. My dad's an enrolled member of the tribe, but I look pretty white. I pass for white in most situations. And my experience as an American Indian woman, with a graduate degree, upper middle class income, passing for white, is a lot different than an American Indian woman who might be very low income or living in a public housing project or on an Indian reservation, someone who might be more connected to the traditional culture than I am. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can disaggregate data, and depending on what the question or problem is, we would want to do that very carefully and do it in different ways that applies to that particular issue or problem.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know in looking at your blog that you have both Estella Lulu Keys and Joyce Chen, who is also an economist like myself, and then Melanie Dela Cruz, who is at UCLA, and we're talking about for Asian women. And I have said to another economist, Marlene Kim, who's at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, that Black women will often talk about being invisible. But when you're looking at data analysis, I often find that Asian women are erased, and the same is often true for Native American women. And people sort of give you the same rationale, right? The data set is too small. We don't have large enough numbers to do the analysis, which often just annoys me. I've been pushing CPS, I shouldn't say CPS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when they're doing the current population survey, and they give us the report, the current economic status report that will come out the first Friday of every month. You can get data for Black men, Black women, white men, white women. You can get it for Hispanic men and women. But then when you come to the group that's Asian, it's Asian and it's 16 and older. And then there's no conversation about the Native American population at all. And so I'm always like, we keep talking about this increased diversity in the US, yet the data that folks are collecting continuously is such that you often can't disaggregate the data, right? Or when you're asking people to disaggregate the data, my experience has been that they kind of look at you like, why ever would I do that? Do people push back against that when you ask them to disaggregate the data?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I think that Usually it's, and I think probably this is true for the census and the current population survey and other things as well, is that, you know, when you're doing population-based sampling to try to produce a sample that's statistically representative of a population, it gets very much increasingly expensive when one of the groups you care about in that population is a very small group. So like Native American is usually about 1% of the population in Minnesota, or any sub-geography of Minnesota other than reservations or certain neighborhoods within Minneapolis. And so in order to get a statistically representative sample of American Indians might cost you 5 or 10 or 20 times as much as any other group because of how small they are in the population. And so that's usually the rationale that I have gotten. This is when we're talking about sampling of a population for like a survey project or something like that. But there's also data that is population level data that's not disaggregated because some of the groups are too small as well, like Minnesota student survey data, or, you know, Minnesota comprehensive assessment, like the testing data that we do, which is a population level data set, right? It's not a sample of students in 11th grade. It's every student in 11th grade other than those that opted out or refused or whatever. And so disaggregation decisions are made at different points in a process, depending on if you're sampling or have population data and other things. So we have to figure out where that's happening in order to know where to push back. But yeah, it's sample size is a lot of times one of the main constraints.
I heard you say two things that really struck me, and that is the cost of actually collecting the data. And it made me go, okay, so, you know, we're going to pay one way or the other, right? You're going to pay in terms of the cost of collecting the data, or you're going to pay because you don't have the appropriate data to craft policies to get at the social issue. So it is where do you want to pay? And often to me, it seems that if you spend the money in collecting the data, it's a one-time cost, and I'm going to put that in quotation marks, because we know that you need to do these samplings periodically, right? So it's not like you can just come and collect the data once and that's going to last you a lifetime. But often it means that when you have these data sets, it allows researchers to go in and analyze the data, and more importantly, several researchers to come in and analyze the data and ask different questions, because most of us have a particular expertise. You know, it might be around health or education, crime, etc. So you could get lots of reports out of that. So sometimes it seems to me that the bang for the buck for the sunk costs up front should outweigh. I mean, like it's a huge return on investment. It has the potential to be a huge return on investment. I'm just not sure how we get folks to understand that relative to the cost of not having the data so that we can craft the appropriate policies, right? I mean, it's really nothing, right? Like, your thoughts on that?
I'll go back to something I started to talk about a little bit earlier, which is that you really want to make sure that you're collecting data at the level that's useful to inform policy and practice. And I'll just give you an example. We do at Wilder Research, we do a statewide homeless survey every 3 years. And this is intended to be a census, right? We try to survey every single person who's experiencing homelessness on the last Thursday in October every 3 years. And in conjunction with the statewide study, we started in 2006 doing an every 3-year reservation homeless study, which is the only study of its kind in the country where we do, again, try to attempt a census of people experiencing homelessness or other precarious housing situations like doubled up and other things on reservations. And one of the things that we didn't used to do a long time ago in the study is we didn't used to ask people their tribal affiliation, right? So we disaggregated the data by race, and we knew we had a certain percentage of American Indians. And we can say, since we've been doing the study in 1991, that American Indians are, 10 to 15 to 20 times overrepresented among the homeless population in the state. But what we couldn't tell the tribes is which of these people are your people, your members. And so when we started disaggregating and measuring the actual tribal affiliation of the people who we were interviewing, we gave this data back to the tribes in the sense of data sovereignty, right? These aren't our data. We don't publish them. We don't use them. We give them to the tribes to use for their purposes, for programming, policy, practice. And the tribes in northern Minnesota, 6 of the 7 Ojibwe tribes banded together, and they used their data that we provided to them to show the state how much of the overall homeless population was actually their people from their reservations. And as a result, they were able to get a pot of money for family homeless prevention funds that previously had been unavailable to tribes and was only accessed by the continuum of care regions in the state. And so being able to use disaggregated data in that way and be able to tell that story about why was disaggregated data helpful for this particular case and to show how it affected policy and funding, I think is one of the things for me that I've been trying to do to, to influence over time, is just to show people how you can use it. And I think that that's one thing that is really hard for a lot of people, researchers and especially non-researchers, is to figure out, even if they're shown a bunch of disaggregated data, how to make sense of it, and what to actually do with it, especially if you're given a table, and there's 150 cells in it, and which of these cells actually mean something, or what should I be talking about? And one of the things that we did that I really, really like a lot with the St. Paul and Minnesota foundations, they have us do this project called East Metro Pulse. And every couple of years, we do a big survey of residents in the East Metro area of the Twin Cities. So it's 3 counties that make up St. Paul and kind of surrounding suburban areas. And we do have a pretty large sample, and we do ask questions about race and ethnicity to be able to disaggregate the data as much as possible. But then we produce these data sets and data tables that are pretty overwhelming for a lot of people, 150 pages of a data book. And so we partnered with the St. Paul and Minnesota foundations to host data parties. And so we brought in like local government officials and nonprofit leaders and others that might want to use the data either to apply to St. Paul Foundation for some funding or for some other purpose. We had the director of the St. Paul Public Libraries at one of our sessions who thought that they could end up using the data to communicate with their city council and stuff. But without that engagement of having a data party and showing people through facilitated activities how to use the data, I can guarantee that most of the people who would have had access to these data tables never would have used them. So I think that there's like that important step when we disaggregate data too, about sort of participatory analysis and kind of walking people through how they could use that data.
So I'm just going to say, as someone who lives and is probably going to die by data, I love that idea of a data party. So I really appreciate that, and really, really love the idea of a data party, because I think, again, for a lot of folks, and it's one of the things that Wiser is hoping to do more of, and that is to consult with other nonprofit organizations. So when you were talking about, you did the analysis, but then you gave it back, right? So that people can actually use it. Data is not a democracy, right? Like, the people who actually need the data aren't often the people who have access to it. Or when people do have the data and they've done the analysis, we're not coming back to the community and sharing it with the community so the community can actually use it. And that really struck me, right? Because, I do realize that a lot of folks don't know economists, they don't know a sociologist, they don't know someone who can look at the data, analyze it for them. And I think it's more than just analyzing it for them. You have to have somebody who can then educate them about what the data means so that they can then advocate for the changes that they need. We're at that point where I ask all my guests, this is probably my favorite part, and that is, I like to ask all of my guests, so tell me, and I like one, but if you've got 2, I'll give you 2. Tell me a myth that's out there that you just wish folks would stop perpetuating.
Okay, yeah, I have 2 closely related myths. The first myth is that American Indian people are something in history, like they were here before European colonizers got here. But a lot of times the way we teach kids history, it's like a thing in the past, and we need to start doing more of showing the Native American astronauts and teachers and chefs and other people that are out here today kind of working in the modern society, and maybe sometimes blending traditional and modern culture, or the indigenous culture with Western culture. And so that's the first myth. And then the closely related one is that there is an American Indian culture, because actually there's like 570 some distinct American Indian tribes, and to a large degree, they all have their own language and spirituality and ceremony and traditions and things like that. And so depending on where you're at, you should figure out whose indigenous land you're on. It's great if you recognize in the first place that you're on indigenous land, but to kind of know the history of the local place that you're at is really important, especially if you're going to be engaging with Native Americans at all, because it's important to us to know that I am Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, not just I'm American Indian. And so that's another myth that I'd like people to stop.
Yeah, so I'm with you. That's a whole nother wiser dialogue, right? And just in terms of how we identify folks as opposed to recognizing how folks identify. Right, which is two different things. So
yeah, well, and then I'll add on to that really quickly too, of tribal enrollment versus racial identity is a thing for American Indians that other people of color don't necessarily have to contend with, because it's a political status as well as a racial identity, and so that just adds a whole other complexity for us Indigenous folks.
And you're right, we don't ask anybody else to do that, right? There's no one else who has to prove their lineage in the same way. And I don't think that folks think about that. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I want to thank my guest, Nicole MartinRogers, Senior Research Manager at Wilder Research. You have been watching Wiser Dialogue, the Missing Viewpoint.